Hello and welcome to the Higher Ed Community Forum. We're really happy to have you here. Today we're going to have a virtual collaborative webinar here about, this really came about as a process of COVID-19, and we'll talk about that. Today we have three panelists talking about critical policy analysis and advocacy and what we can do in these really tenuous times to think about that and plan for the future. I'm your moderator and host, Linda DeAngelo, and welcome. Feel free also during this to use the chat function that is available, and you can chat. It'd be good if you want to introduce yourself now. Feel free to introduce your institution, where you're from, maybe your concerns, what brought you to this webinar. This webinar was created really out of the vision of one of our speakers today, Eric Felix, and also Julie Marlett, who is helping us in the background today. They hatched this through Twitter, which is an exciting thing to do. I remember seeing, hey, is there a higher ed forum, speakers forum, and what can we do about that? And how can we offer support to faculty and content and things like that in this time? You know, today is for myself in particular, is a day that's noted on my calendar. This is the day I was supposed to be flying to San Francisco to start AERA, which was planned to start tomorrow, and I was so looking forward to it. And so this forum is perfect and an opportunity, these types of forums, for us to come together as a community and to still share knowledge and to really be with one another. So I'm particularly thankful on this day that I would be starting a major trip to be able to have this forum to be here with it. There is some information here on where you can find, this is part 3 of a 4-part webinar series. So our next up webinar, I want to give a shout out to the webinar that's coming up. It's Supporting Queer Student Success. And it is on Monday, April 20th. So just around the corner, next Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. So make sure, if you're interested, to tune into that webinar. There are also 2 previously recorded webinars. One was on higher education affordability and student impact, and the other one on internationalization in higher education. You can find all the information for those webinars, the past readings plus the recordings, at the little itty bitty little link here. So there you'll find this, the readings, the speaker bios, etc., of who was on that webinar. Recordings will be also uploaded. Some are available, some are coming. I also recommend that you follow the Higher Education Forum on the Twitter account. The recordings from this webinar as well as past webinars will show up first on that tweet. They'll be tweeted out there, but they'll also be available again on that itty bitty link. So we're seeing different folks come in. Now we're going to also launch a poll. We want to hear from you about where where are you situated in higher ed? Are you a student, instructor, researcher, practitioner, community member, policymaker? So we're going to get that poll launched right now. So go ahead and respond to that poll. Right now we have someone already on our chat, Matthew, and he says he's from a community college in Ohio. Ohio is my neighbor. I'm in Pennsylvania right now, so I always say, hey neighbor, to anyone. If you know this area of the country, Pennsylvania, Western PA, where I am in Ohio, you can drive to Ohio by accident from here. So it's pretty exciting. So here what we have, right now, 48% are students, instructors, 24%, researcher practitioners, 38%, policymakers, 14%. We'll give you another second to, oh, we got someone from Philly also. That's definitely my neighbor across the state. All right, so on our agenda today, I'm going to first introduce our panelists. Then each of our panelists is going to have individual time to share with us. We'll have a discussion. We'll use your chat as well as some prepared questions during that discussion. And then we'll end with question and answers. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. First off, we have Eric Felix. First of all, panelists, is it all right if I call you guys by your first names?
Yes.
All right, so I see some thumbs up and yeses. So I'm going to refer to everybody by their first name. So Eric Felix is currently an assistant professor at San Diego State University back in my home state, which I miss always. I've actually known Eric since 2012, but only recently have we really become acquainted with each other. But I've respected his work for a long time in the critical policy analysis work he does. So Eric, to me, is a true servant of the public and the public good. If you've read his biography that is available for you online, you'll see that he sees his role as a scholar and a practitioner as one of public service. And his role then is assisting our nation and the state of California in particular, which is my home state, in fulfilling its promise to affordable, quality, and transformative education. Eric's work focuses most directly on understanding how the implementation of student success policies and those reform efforts benefit, harm, and or render invisible Latinx students and other racially minoritized groups. His work is aimed at creating policy reform that will improve racial equity in higher education. And I'd say all three of our panelists, that's where they're focused today, as is my work focus there. Our next panelist is Cecilia Orphan. Cecilia is an assistant professor at the University of Denver. The University of Denver is always going to have a special place in my heart. I haven't told you this, Cecilia, but my father is an alumni of the University of Denver. So I've known about this institution since basically the time I was born, and early alumni. Back, the institution was very different in the 50s, but still proud alumni. Cecilia brings an institutional and organizational lens to her work, and this really complements the perspectives of Eric and CJ. Her expertise is on comprehensive institutions. These institutions are kind of that middle ground. We don't know as much about them, though they're very important in expanding educational attainment across the United States, and a large proportion of our students attend them. So she'll be talking about the importance of these institutions in facilitating educational opportunity and civic life, and really looking at how administrators and policymakers can promote equity through these institutions and help us to have higher education serve its public purposes, which I think is one of the key things that I think about. If you've read Cecilia's biography, you know that the big question in her work is, what are higher education's purposes in society that aspires to be democratic? We couldn't ask a more important question always, but particularly at this time. And we had a sustained assault, as many of us know, or are living in higher education for over a decade now, maybe 2 decades. And we can see that only intensifying as a result of the current pandemic. Our last panelist today is CJ Powell. CJ is a higher education program analyst at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. At the conference, he coordinates and leads a group of 50 national civil rights and policy organizations. CJ is deeply aware of how higher education policy differentially impacts minoritized groups, and how those impacts change in both rural and urban contexts. I consider CJ to kind of be our policy wonk of this group. He's going to tell us all about different acts and what they mean, and he'll really share that with us. And also talk about how these can differentially harm minoritized populations. CJ's expertise includes issues of access and how practices such as the Common Application can affect minoritized groups. Lastly, again, I'm Linda DeAngelo. I'm an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. My work is more related to students and student outcomes, and I would say I have policy relevant outcomes, but these three panelists are the policy experts studying policy. I'm happy to have them here and to moderate this panel. So we're going to go in this order that you see here, with CJ going first, Eric second, and Cecilia third. So up here we have some of CJ's two awesome pieces that he contributed for our reading. Again, those readings are available on this bitty link here, and I'm going to turn this over to CJ so that he can talk about the CARES Act, among some other things that are really important for us to know about.
Thanks, Linda. Making sure everyone can hear me, so can I get a thumbs up from my fellow panelists? Perfect. So yes, I'm here to talk about the CARES Act. And Linda did a really great job of introducing me in my bio. So I think about all of this higher education policy through the lens of civil rights and what does it mean for communities who have been marginalized. So the CARES Act is the big, historic, unprecedented $2 trillion package that was passed and signed into law. And I'm only going to focus on the higher education aspects of it. And so the big things that the CARES Act has done for higher education is that it created an education stabilization fund. Part of that fund is for K-12, and part of that is for higher education. Part of that fund is, it provides $3 billion for governors to have discretionary spending on either K-12 or higher education, and agencies and institutions that have been significantly impacted by the coronavirus. So discretionary funding can sometimes give people in civil rights either a heart attack or it'll make us jump for joy, depending on who has the discretion, right? And so that is going to go, that's going to play into a lot of like state advocacy and what can happen in order to influence these governors to make sure that these monies are going to the right places. Aside from that, $14.25 billion has been set aside for just higher education. And with that comes a maintenance of effort requirement, which is just saying that the state has to do certain things in order to get these funds. And that maintenance of effort requirement is that states must maintain their average funding for K-12 or higher ed from the last 3 fiscal years for the next 3 fiscal years. So they should use this money to make sure that they are able to maintain that funding for the states, but then also it is really important to note that there is a significant waiver authority to the education secretary regarding this maintenance of effort. So that means that a state doesn't necessarily have to do or fulfill the maintenance of effort requirement, and then that if they can apply for a waiver from the Secretary of Education, whom people will have feelings about, and that she can just waive that authority and say, hey, that's totally okay that you did not meet those maintenance of effort requirements. As it relates to the higher ed funds, about $13 billion is delivered directly to colleges from the Department of Education. 3/4 of those funds are to be distributed to institutions based on their full-time Pell enrollment. It's really important to note that it is the Pell enrollment and not students that qualify for Pell. And so that is going to go into the discussion about how community colleges and regional comprehensive universities are affected by this funding. And then the remaining quarter will be distributed to schools based on their non-Pell enrollment. Institutions must use at least half of the funds they receive to provide emergency financial aid grants to students for expenses related to the corona disruption. So that is a pretty broad category, which is great because this is going to affect different students in different ways. So it can help with food, housing security, course materials, technology for those course materials, because we know that there's a pretty significant digital divide, particularly in rural areas, but also in some urban areas. Childcare and healthcare disruptions as it relates to COVID-19, they're all examples of how these funds can be used for the on the student's behalf. What is one really great thing these institutions or these monies cannot be used for is that they cannot use these funds to reimburse themselves. So a lot of institutions are issuing refunds and trying to figure out how to best serve students, which is great. But also these funds, at least half of these funds, have to go to students, go into the students' hands as their education has been disrupted, and institutions cannot use this to reimburse themselves for refunding students' housing fees and things like that. Additionally, there's about $1 billion reserved for HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions to divvy up. So $1 billion for HBCUs and minority-serving institutions to divvy up amongst themselves, which as institutions that serve a large number of Pell Grant recipients and also Black and Latino and students from other communities such as AAPI or Native communities, this isn't necessarily a ton of money to make sure that these students are being served and that these institutions that are doing the lion's share of serving these students can be served. As it relates to student debt relief, the CARES Act, the bill suspends all involuntary collections of defaulted student loans, including wage and Social Security garnishments and tax refund offsets. So this is really significant, particularly because we know how student loan debt affects communities of color. We know that there's a large number of students, Black and Latino students, who might default on student loans in the first 20 years after that they've taken them out. And so making sure that there's no involuntary collections is going to be really helpful to easing the mind of those students or those student borrowers who have perhaps defaulted or are in delinquency, but need to also think about putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their head. The CARES Act also instructs the Education Department to automatically suspend payments on most federal student loans. So that means direct loans and federally held FFEL loans. An additional caveat to that is that commercially held FFEL loans are not currently included, even though the student loan borrowers had no choice whether or not their servicer was going to have their loan be commercially held or still remain federally held. So my student loans are through Navient. I go in, I see that, oh, my FFEL loans are commercially held. That means that there's nothing happening to those loans. I'm still expected to pay those as the CARES Act is currently written. Another one is that it also doesn't cover Perkins campus loans. So that's just a heads up for folks. And then after September 30th, payment suspension and interest waivers will end, and borrowers are going to start receiving communications from their servicer about restarting their payment. So no interest will have accrued over this time, but come September 30th, as it currently stands, student loan servicers might be back knocking on your door, in your email box, or on your phone. Some really great things, though, about the suspension is that months of the suspended pay will also count as qualifying payments for borrowers who are rehabilitating defaulted loans. And they will also count towards public service loan forgiveness, as well as income-driven loan repayment if you're on those particular plans. And which might be really a small thing to most people, but really impactful for a lot, is that the Education Department has to report these payments to credit bureaus as though they're normal on-time payments. So there won't be any damage to credit scores, which again, communities of color and low-income communities are always trying to climb out of this credit doldrum that they can get stuck in if they're choosing to pay for their student loans, or they're choosing to pay for their food over their student loans. As it relates to institutions of higher education emergency aid, institutions have latitude to not have to match campus-based aid programs anymore. So your supplemental education opportunity grants and things like that, those are funds that can now just be funneled to students for emergency scholarships. And there is a waiver so that you don't, when you report back to the institute or to the Department of Education, you don't have to match those funds, which is really helpful. Additionally, institutions of higher education should and can still issue work study payments to students who aren't able to work due to COVID-19 disruptions. And so that's gonna be really helpful for those students who are at home and they perhaps don't qualify for the stimulus check because they are under 24 and full-time students. And so this is gonna be helpful to keep giving them money in that regard. And then additionally, students who leave school as a result of COVID-19 issues won't be penalized in the future by excluding because the term will be excluded from counting towards financial aid term limits. and the waiving of satisfactory academic progress requirements from the Department of Education. So that's going to be really helpful in terms of providing people that flexibility to come back to school if their path takes them somewhere else for a little while because they need to shore up some funds in order to return to higher education. And then lastly, the big bucket, which is fascinating, is that employer tax credit for student loan borrowers. So the bill expands existing tax exclusions for employer-provided education assistance to include student loan benefits. So now companies can choose to pay student loan payments and receive a tax break for it, which is nice. I don't know what companies those are, so if you know them, let me know because they can pay for our student loans. But one thing that I wanted to highlight about the advocacy that's related to this is that everything related to COVID-19 moves very quickly. And so a lot of times for communities of color and advocates who are working on behalf of marginalized communities and not just institutions of higher education, they have to work really quickly in order to understand the needs of their community and then send that over to Hill staffers and to the Hill so that they can get those, use that window to influence packages to the best of their ability. Now, this is all happening with the background of some regulatory implications at the same time. So currently, for instance, Title IX, there's a Title IX rule that the Education Department was super thrilled about, but most advocates were not, that has cleared the final hurdle. And so there can, at any moment, be a drop of a pretty terrible, what will be assumed to be terrible, Title IX rule, while all this COVID-19 stuff is happening. So the way that institutions are handling Title IX can be perceived to change, even though those rules don't take effect for another year, but there will be a lot of things happening at the same time. And then also schools have transitioned quickly to online education, distance education, and what does that mean for students with disabilities? Are they meeting those students' needs in accessible ways? That's another thing that is also happening, as well as the bigger issues are that flexibility may be good, but it can also be bad. And student loan debt forgiveness needs to be a part of the conversation as we start thinking about stimulus, as well as we think about how the debt burden is disproportionately held by students of color, as well as women and people at the intersection of those identities. And then lastly, community colleges are being essentially penalized for the flexibility they offer students because they're not receiving as much funding. And we know that as we enter a recession, people will be going back to community colleges and other institutions of higher education to retool and retrain, but they won't have as many resources as some of these larger four-year institutions. So that is kind of the overarching picture of the CARES Act. And then thinking about how these are also happening concurrently with regulatory things that aren't going to be great for already vulnerable student populations.
Well, thanks, CJ. That's a lot of information. I wanted to, if you could just distill down for us a little bit, like as an institution, these are the concerns. As a student, we certainly have concerns related to loans and the way loan forgiveness were not happening, but interest is. And I didn't know about the private loans. And then going forward, so the regulatory things that are being kind of slipped in. Can you just distill down for us that like maybe 3 points you want to leave with us that are important for us to think about in terms of the CARES Act and its impact on institutions and students?
Yes, so the 3 things I would think about is the flexibility that the CARES Act allows institutions. So there's a conversation about who is eligible for receiving these emergency grants, because it's not Title IV funds or federal education funds, but an additional pot of money. And so there aren't the same restrictions on who is eligible for those funds. So normally for Title IV funds, undocumented students might not be eligible and things like that, but there isn't any explicit exclusion of these students from the CARES Act. And so I would encourage institutions to use that money broadly and flexibly to help students who are already being marginalized by current higher education policy as well as current higher education costs. I think for students, they need to make sure that they're the information for these emergency grants is accessible in multiple different ways, and that is getting to the students and their families. So if that means that they need to create these portals and have them in multiple different languages, or make sure that you have a point person for different communities on your campus, send out the links to these portals, making sure that students are eligible to receive these funds, and the students who are already part of marginalized communities are eligible to receive these funds are going to be really helpful. And then as it relates to student loan borrowers, making sure that you know if you have commercially held FFEL loans, if you have any private loans, knowing that those aren't covered, and that these are technical fixes that we're hoping to get into another COVID package. But if that doesn't happen, just know kind of where you stand as it relates to those loans.
Okay, yeah, these are really important points. We know that minoritized communities are oftentimes the last people to take advantage of these types of funds. And so making sure that we get to them, and the fact that we can, there are no explicit rules against supporting undocumented students with these funds is another important thing. And thank you very much for emphasizing that. Institutions have to work hard at this and getting this message out into the right people in order for this really to make a difference in the communities where they need it. All right, next up, we're going to have Eric Felix, and here are a couple of Eric's pieces that he recommends today, and also another one by two other scholars that is at the Education Trust. Again, those are available on our itty bitty link, and let's welcome Eric.
Hi, good morning. Nice to see, well, not see, but nice to look at the chat and see so much engagement and interaction. So thank you for being here. CJ, thank you for that introduction of, as you mentioned, the historic legislation that is trying to do some difference for institutions and students in higher education. So again, my name is Eric Felix. I'm a son of Central American and Mexican immigrants. Happy to be here today to have this conversation. First generation Pell Grant really supported me through my undergraduate. And now I'm an assistant professor that's able to share my research and my insight with y'all today. Next slide, please. I think for me, it's important to just share a little bit about my background and what motivates my research. First and foremost, I highlight TRIO, especially upward bound math and science. Before that intervention, I was like, if there was AP for home economics, I was like home economics BC. I had taken my third class of home ec. I was taking woodshop. I was taking like Microsoft Access and Word, and I assumed, you know, cool, my counselors care about me. These are the classes I need. And then upward bound saw my transcript, and they're like, as a sophomore, why are you taking all these classes? And I was like, I don't know, that's what they gave me, right? And so I quickly realized that I was being tracked, and my aspirations for what I could achieve were being kind of shaped by individuals that didn't have my best interest or benefit, right? And then as a scholar, the second image highlights the ways that community colleges are sometimes demonized for the ways that they receive dollars and interpret reform. And then ultimately, you know, with one single data source, headlines, newspapers, journalists, legislators see that, you know, $900 million, and 5 years later, California Student Success Initiative slow to increase community college success rates, right? And so for me, it's always about, well, what's happening on the ground that is continuing to create these kind of narratives that community colleges, practitioners, students within them aren't explicitly using resources in certain ways. And so what I try to do is do deep ethnographic policy work to really understand the culture, the interactions, the ways that policy interacts with students, practitioners, leaders, and many other sources. And then the last image is of my grandmother and my son. And I think in terms of critical policy work, it really drains us, right? I assume that those of us on the panel, like it tires us, it fatigues us, it sometimes makes us question why we're studying all these things when we know so much harm is being done to institutions, communities, and students. And so I really think about what sustains my work is the possibilities of what can be, right? So I think of my grandmother who was barred from education because she was a woman in Guatemala. And so opportunity denied. I think of, again, being an assistant professor, having all the opportunities afforded to me, and then my 2-year-old in terms of the possibilities of what can be. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, my approach to critical policy analysis is a race-conscious approach. And this was something that early on was inspired by my work with the Center for Urban Education and Estela Ben-Simone, as well as reading all of the works by Michael J. Dumas on critical policy and political economy work, right? Which asks us to not just examine policy, but right, to go further. And for me, it really is an approach to understand the ways that policy decisions, the framing, the mandates, the instruments included, benefit, harm, or render invisible racially minoritized students. And that's the conversation that I'll be having in a couple minutes related to this pandemic and things that I've seen in the public sphere. And the second thing that I mentioned is that I love to examine what I call the flow of policy reform. Again, moving away from ahistoric, linear, and kind of these normative ways of studying policy to think about how policy flows from the Capitol to the campus, to practitioners, to students. What are the ideologies within them? What are the inherent values? What's the interaction? What does implementation look like? And ultimately, what's the impact, right? Is it an opportunity to enhance student equity, or does it actually deter and perpetuate inequities for students? And so for me, what I've been doing is studying primarily, transfer reform, student equity reform, developmental education reform. First and foremost, related to analysis and advocacy, is trying to squeeze discretion from vague language, right? So like, where do we take this sentence in this mandate to allow for you to be race conscious? Or what compels individuals to endure the pushback, the resistance when they say, I want to specifically target racialized minorities, or I want to create a program that benefits Black students or Latinx students. And so to understand how they act and they see the racial possibilities of policy reform. And then lastly, we know that individuals aren't operating on their own. And so what are the contextual conditions on campus? What are the factors that enable or restrict this type of implementation? Because we have studied so many ways that policies fail the intent, or the hope is kind of not there in terms of wanting to make a difference in terms of equity or student success. So like, why do these sites find levels of success in terms of addressing racial disparities on campus? Next slide. So I decided to come up with some fresh stuff for today. And for me, the question that I thought about within my work, my expertise, and the current reality, this pandemic is really highlighting our policy choices and the ways that they harm communities of color. And it's making it so visible to me and to so many others. But my question still is it enough for policymakers to care or to take action, right? And so that's like the question that I'll be holding space for this entire semester, summer. It's like, we're seeing this play out. And Linda, if you want to advance the slide, we're seeing that in healthcare, in our public health efforts, and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 in terms of who gets sick, but ultimately who's dying, right? We think about that in terms of urban and dense places, primarily Black communities, New Orleans, Detroit, New York, and thinking about like, why is it that we are having these kind of impacts? And based on CDC reports and things of that nature, we just can't ignore that COVID-19 and this pandemic is hurting racially minoritized communities more than any other. We think about the economic uncertainty that brings, right? Many look at stock market indices and things of that nature, but how will this exacerbate the racial wealth gap? And what are the implications for affordability and student loan debt? And then ultimately, as CJ brought up, right, the CARES Act. Who deserves to be supported, how much, and then who gets left out? I think one of the things that I was thinking about when CJ talked is these decisions are made in moments of crisis, right? And in certain ways, I would describe it as haphazard policymaking. And so ultimately, there are things that are on the radar, right? But that's focused in terms of who the legislative aides are, or who's advocating, or who has the ear of a senator or a congressperson. But ultimately, what groups, what vulnerable communities are left out the most? And if you want to advance the slides. So I had layered this a little bit different, but we were having some issues with animations. But what I thought about doing was talking about the racial realities, right? So with healthcare, we know that communities of color have experienced environmental racism for years and years and years, expanding exposure to asthma, to diabetes, to a variety of health conditions. And we know that, with these reports that they are being hit the hardest. And then if you look at the column to the furthest right, policy response, right? So like, I was, just as many of you, enraged by Surgeon General Jerome Adams when the disaggregated data based on race was showing the significant numbers of Black and brown communities dying from COVID-19. And the rhetoric, right, because we study language, we study discourse, was basically saying, you need to step up, right? So deficit oriented, you need to stop doing drugs, you need to stop doing alcohol, and then also very paternalistic, right? Like, you need to do this for, as the quote says, you need to do this for your pop, you need to do this for your abuela, you need to do this for your big mama, right? So instead of acknowledging the deep-rooted policy decisions that have created these health disparities, is again about the individual, right? It's about the deficits that the community has. And so just perpetuating things we see in higher education. The second topic that I thought of, again, that I talked about was the racial wealth gap, right? There's a history of enslavement, of genocide, of redlining, Jim Crow laws that have severely impacted who has wealth, who's able to own, who's able to have these commodities, right? And if you look at the report by Ed Trust West, they clearly outline the ways that race and socioeconomic status are tied, but ultimately the ways that Black families struggle much more than any other racial and ethnic group, right? Where Black individuals that have a bachelor's degree still earn less or have a lower household income and wealth than white adults who never completed high school, right? And how is that actually a thing, right? And that actually impacts their children in terms of the ways that they are able to afford or not afford higher education, right? So in terms of my policy response, we often think of this as a natural occurrence, right? That the wealth gap just exists. It is what it is. And much of our policies do not attend to them, right? And when we think of promise programs or other things, we try to say, let it still be merit-based, let it still be universal, where everyone gets support, but it's not targeted based on these well-known racial realities. And the last one that CJ had mentioned is that we have racial stratification in our higher education system, right? And we see that concentrated in community college. They are underfunded. They are overtaxed in terms of supporting racially minoritized students, part-time students, English language learners, students with disabilities, adult reentry students, anyone, right? We talk about it in democratic ways that this is an open access institution, but when we say that, we also don't fund it like an open access institution. And so one of the big things that we're seeing with the CARES Act is that funding formula, right, or at least that allocation based on FTES is doing so much harm. And I know CJ used kinder words, right, but they are not benefiting. They are actually continuing to be stratified in terms of the funding they receive or don't receive, right? So when you do it based on full-time equivalent status, knowing that so many part-time students are in community college, they do not benefit from this package as other institutions do, as well as the caveat that any student that was doing distance or online education before the pandemic would not be included, right? And we think of the efforts that community colleges have done over the last 5 to 10 years to provide broad access, not just to urban communities, but to rural communities. And now in some ways they're being penalized for that broad access. And I know Cecilia will talk a little bit more about regional comprehensives, but I think that's a big thing. It's we've asked to broaden access to put higher education in remote places. And this formula, again, kind of denotes this, continuous policy choice in response to not clearly include community colleges and the students it serves in the formulas and the allocation decisions they choose. If we go to the next slide. So I think the big thing for me is just thinking about, someone asked me like a year ago if I was ever tired of critiquing policy and just, leaving the recommendations and the implications on papers and stuff like that. And I've been thinking about that so much in terms of how we move from critical policy analysis to advocacy. And for me, the big thing is that, we need to take a lot of this into our own hands. We need to not just provide compelling research and evidence. Yep, staying at home, that's what's up. Got my 2-year-old in the background. So what I'll do is I'll wrap up a little quicker, but ultimately thinking about the ways that we have conversations with legislative aides, the ways that we use voting, elections, not just to inform policymakers, but to vote better ones in, right? Ones that share our experiences, one that understand race and structurally racist policies, structures, and our history. And so for me, the big thing is that we just don't need better policies, but we need better policymakers that are aware of our social realities. The 3 things that I mentioned are just ones that are easy to kind of look at, but I'm still worried that even though these things are so evident in society by us in higher education, as scholars, as practitioners, as researchers, is it still enough for our legislators, whether at the state or federal level, to acknowledge the root causes of racial inequality, but more important, to take action, right? And to take action to move us forward in a more just and equitable higher education. And I'm not quite so sure that these are goals and aims that we share in terms of critical policy researchers and policymakers making the decisions that we end up studying and trying to make better. That's it.
Thanks, Eric. We're going to move on to Cecilia in a second. And certainly don't worry about your toddler in the background. I see people on our chat saying, yeah, I thought that was my toddler. I had to think for a second, whose toddler was that, right? So we're all at home doing everything we can. One of our, on the chat, one of our attendees said, one of his long-term concerns, and Cecilia is certainly going to talk about this a little, is educational deserts that are further exacerbated. You were talking about long-distance students and this not the online, not being, a lot of these students may be online because they don't have access to an institution, as well as for other types of reasons, and that this is going to further exacerbate the the tensions that already exist and the disenfranchisement that already exists for students in educational deserts who can't travel to institutions. Do you have any thoughts related to that, as you were talking about those different areas where we have to think about the policy impacts that you presented, Eric?
Yeah, I think one of the big things would be just really understanding the resource allocation to address what you just mentioned, right? It's not just technology, it's not just internet, but like, what does it fundamentally take for us to address what Dr. Vanessa Sansone or Nick Hillman or many others have talked about, geographies and the ways that higher education are not in these communities. And so I think potentially having distance education is great, but there is so much more that we've been tackling for the last 10 to 15 years that I think it really is resource allocation, but it's more so, the 2 people that I just mentioned, I mean, they have had answers in their work, in their presentations, when they've testified in front of like legislatures. But again, I think it's ultimately the willingness of policymakers at the state level and at the federal level. We can provide briefs, we can provide like a 3-minute, snapshot of all this research and synthesize everything. But ultimately, it's the willingness of policymakers. Is it us demanding for these types of changes? Is it us voting people out? Is it us working with advocacy groups like CJ's association to make these things happen, right? So I think ultimately, for me, it's how do we get policymakers to become aware, to acknowledge, and then to be willing to take action for these communities, especially when many of them are not in rural areas and never really understand the true inequity and digital divide that they experience.
All right, great. Well, we're going to move along. I do want to mention that we also have another person on chat saying that they want to push back against the notion of deserts to explain inequities and thinking about indigenous communities whose homelands are part of these things. And so we can't think about things as a monolith or why people are positioned in different spaces, and really honor where people are positioned and how we best can can then have them access what they need. So thanks for that. All right, we're going to move on to Cecilia and her discussion. I also saw in the chat a few of you posting questions that you want answered in the Q&A, and so I'll go back to those things and make note of them so that we can make sure they get discussed. All right, take it away, Cecilia.
All right, can you go back to my last slide, actually, please? Thank you. So it's a blessing and somewhat of a curse to go last. A blessing in the sense that I get to build on what everyone has shared, and a curse because the two previous panelists are just brilliant and have sparked so many new ideas in me that I don't think I can fit them into the next 12 minutes that I'm allotted. So I'm going to do my best. As Julie mentioned, my name is Cecilia, or Linda, sorry, mentioned my name is Cecilia Orphan, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Denver. And I just want to thank CJ first for providing such an excellent policy analysis. It's been like drinking water from a fire hose, trying to keep up with what the CARES Act will mean for higher education and for students. And so to have you provide that background is just really, really helpful and helps frame my remarks and my thinking about how this current stimulus package and any ones that will be pending in the future will affect regional comprehensive universities in particular, but higher education as a whole and the students that we serve. And then of course to Eric, I've been such a fan and admirer of your work for so long and the critical perspectives that you bring to policy. Every ASH session, every conference that I see your name, I'm in your audience because I just learned so much from you. And in particular, I'm really inspired by how you personalize your approach to policy. So I do the same in my own work. I'm the first person on my mother's side to graduate from high school and the first person on my father's side to graduate from college. And so for me, this work is very personal. I'm a Powell recipient. I did what many first-gen college students do, and I swirled. I attended 3 different institutions. It took me 5 years. Proud community college alumni, and I graduated from Portland State University, which is a regional comprehensive in Portland, Oregon. And so in many ways, policymakers would view my time at the community college as a failure because I didn't count towards their completion goals. However, I got what I needed and moved on to the regional. And so when I think about policy, I always think about the ways in which different students like myself, and then in particular students of color, are viewed and situated in our policy projects. All right, so you can transition to the next slide. So I have spent the last 20 years of 18 years of my life either attending, studying, or working for regional comprehensive universities. And some people call them regional publics. I really like to keep the word comprehensive in the name of this sector because they do have this comprehensive mission to, and I've conceptualized it as a tripartite mission of facilitating regional well-being, so civic, social, cultural, educational, economic well-being of their regions. So you'll see them adapt and offer degrees in programming, invite cultural events. They educate most of the school teachers in their regions. They've probably educated the mayor or different legislators in their regions. So really thinking about aligning their offerings, their educational programming with what their regions needs. They also quite significantly promote post-secondary access. And I have this as a later bullet point, but they are, of all sectors of higher education, they are the ones that do the most to bring people who come in at the bottom economic quintile for income and bring them up to the top quintile. So they're transformational institutions. And I'm personally an evidence of that because they changed my life. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Regional Comprehensive or the community college I attended, Lynn Benton Community College in Albany, Oregon. And then the third piece is that they're incredibly student-centered, and they do that at a significant cost and not being funded at a level that accounts for this broad comprehensive mission that they have. But you'll see them adapt student services and programming directly to meet the needs of their students, and their student bodies are going to look different because unlike my institution, which is a private institution considered to be somewhat prestigious in our region, we don't look like our state. We don't look like Denver. My alma mater, Portland State, you see a 1-to-1 match in the demographics in that community. And you see that in regionals. They just look like they're regions because they are the regional access point. So around 4 million students attend these institutions. You see various marginalized groups that are gaining access to higher education. And half of the students that attend regionals are folks like me who started at a community college, or maybe they go to a regional for a year and they dip out and take classes at the community college. And there are a number of part-time students. So many of the same kind of student traits and student educational habits that happen in community colleges also happen in regionals. They also educate a significant proportion of public health workers and education leaders. And so during a pandemic, they're always important, but particularly now. And then many hold minority serving institution designation. Again, that's by virtue of mirroring the demographics of their regions. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, and I forgot to mention on the previous slide, the image that I showed was of the bridge that crosses one of the main streets, that Portland State University. It's just kind of plopped down in the middle of Portland, Oregon. And that really is their mission, to let knowledge serve the city. So here are a few other mission statements from my hometown, or my home state now. And in these mission statements, you can kind of see those the tripartite mission shown. So Fort Lewis College offers an accessible, high-quality baccalaureate liberal arts education to diverse student population, preparing citizens for the common good. They're also a native serving institution. They have somewhat of a complicated history, though, because they were originally a normal school and were an active participant in the colonial project in the US, and they still have colonial aspects to what they do, but they do remain also an access point for Native individuals and indigenous individuals. Colorado State University Pueblo, which is a Hispanic serving institution in Southern Colorado, they mentioned that they provide leadership and access for its region. And more recently, they've started to identify as the People's University and use that in their branding. And they'll brag about accepting the top 100% of students. They're fully open enrollment, open access institution. And then Colorado Mesa University, and they talk about the larger community that they serve, and they offer exceptional teaching, they promote diversity, social responsibility, really thinking about that common good in Colorado and beyond. So at this time, now that I've provided kind of an introduction to regionals, I wondered if you could show that poll asking, now that you know a little bit more about how I define them, if you were a student or currently work at a regional, go ahead and participate in this poll. We can kind of get a sense of how many folks that have touched the sector or been touched by the sector are on the call. So Linda, do we see will we just automatically see the results? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Here we are. We're gonna go ahead and close the poll.
So we have 40, nearly half of people. And this is, you'll see that too in just the number of people who have college degrees. They have been such an important generator of college attainment across communities, and in particular for marginalized communities. And this isn't to say, and I've been critical, my work looks at both critical policy analysis, but then also administrative leadership. And they're not all perfect. Some of them get it and do it really well. Others are striving for prestige and kind of abandoning that regional comprehensive mission. But there are many exemplars that have done such important work to transform student lives and the lives of their communities. So in critical policy analyses, we are really pushed, as Eric shared, to consider the benefits, who benefits from policy in terms of how resources are allocated, how attention is allocated, and how people are situated or defined by policy. And so within higher education, and when we think about some of the critical policy challenges facing RCUs, the first, and Eric talked about this beautifully, but has to do with the stratification that we have in higher education. We have stratified funding for higher education. We fund those institutions that have access missions the least. And we also stratify the legitimacy, who we view, what institutions do we view as high quality, as important, and the kind of disparaging ways that we talk about regionals and community colleges. You'll hear people say it's just 13th grade, or, oh, I'm just going to name your regional comprehensive university, as if that is not a good or worthwhile option. And what I've argued in my work is that the way that that legitimacy is assigned and funding is distributed really maps onto racism and classism in our society. The second is that they are being pressed to respond to accountability demands, increased efficiency, and increased demonstration of economic benefit. So that kind of neoliberal project creeping in, at the same time as their funding has been decreased. And in many instances, as we saw in CJ's description of the CARES Act, public policy is really normed to state flagships or research institutions. So you see privileging of those institutional types within policy. And then again, just the deficit-based ways in which the sector and its students are viewed. These institutions operate at razor-thin margins and have very small reserves, if any reserves. So any kind of financial shocks can really significantly harm their ability to provide access and important student services to help support students who have been marginalized by K-12 education, who haven't been given the best quality K-12 education that come with just additional needs for support. I had to take remedial education. Many students attending regionals did. And so when we continue to cut their funding, we cut at their ability to address those concerns. There also are enrollment declines that the sector is facing, and this is across the board in higher ed, but it's an acute concern for regionals because that is they get state support, and then they get tuition dollars. They don't have as many other revenue sources as, say, a research institution does. And often their alumni are not as wealthy and as able to give as maybe Harvard. They are also just still grappling with recessionary cuts that have forced them to cut those essential student and regional services at the same time as they've raised tuition. And so they've still never gotten back to where they were before the recession. And so that's why we see an increase in student loan debt, because we see these institutions having to increase tuition to be able to address the funding cuts. COVID-19 specific related issues, so they've had to offer student refunds. Some are already doing staff layoffs. There obviously is enrollment volatility that we're facing, so we don't know how many students are going to come back in the fall. Online infrastructure investments, so trying to get faculty up to speed. Just antivirus cleaning costs, just making sure the campuses are sanitary, and then providing emergency aid to students. Can I see the next slide, please? So just some quick policy recommendations, and we can have more time for these in the question and answer. And these are just quick and dirty policy recommendations. I'm a researcher, so I would like more time to research and make more informed decisions about what we might recommend. But much of this builds on what I learned in studying regionals as they responded to the Great Recession and the funding cuts during that time. And the first is that in terms of the next stimulus package, which I hope there'll be one, it sounds like from CJ they will be, there needs to be targeted, and it's great that they, this current stimulus package emphasize direct student aid. That's wonderful, but we also need to support these institutions. Otherwise, we're going to hurt college access. We know that for every funding cut that happens for regionals and community colleges, there's a direct cut in college access. So the next stimulus package needs to provide targeted aid for those COVID-19 related expenses, especially for minority serving institutions. And we need to stop privileging full-time enrollment, because as Eric shared and as I've shared, many regional students, meaning community college students, attend part-time. They're working full-time. Maybe they're taking care of children or parents. So they did to privilege full-time enrollment is really problematic. We also need to continue the Pell enrollment premium. That's a great benefit for community colleges and regionals. And I would argue for adding an underrepresented minority premium. I don't know if that's going to happen in the current administration, but that would be really powerful. We also, I think, and this is a recommendation that David Tamberg, Sophia Latterman, and Andy Carlson at SHIO have made, but to create federal-state partnership to address these short-term funding shortfalls with the commitment that states restore pre-recessionary funding. So we have aspects of that in the current stimulus package. I think there needs to be a more robust federal involvement in state funding to get them back on track. Because currently higher education, as we all know, serves as the balance wheel for state funding, meaning that they have other constitutional mandates they have to fund, and when they need to cut funding, they cut it from higher ed. I think too, distributing state aid according to institutional vulnerability, so flipping our current aid funding model, instead of funding flagships that are becoming increasingly out of state institutions at the highest level, we need to flip that pyramid and fund the access institutions higher. And then funding and legislating for that regional service mission. Often policy really focuses on the access mission of regionals, which is really great. However, they also provide that regional service that I have described, and that regional service is very important. So for example, Shawnee State University in Southern Ohio and Appalachia, high poverty area, they provide $5 teeth cleanings and a mobile health clinic to people who are place-bound in their region. That doesn't count in the performance funding model for Ohio. So we need to change those approaches to policy for the sector. And then finally, one thing that I've been arguing, and a few colleagues of mine have been arguing, is that we need to create a rural serving institution designation, to the point of the potential for rural communities to lose their higher education institutions with these incoming funding shocks. This could be a way to shore up their rural institutions. So if you could show me the last slide, and I'll just blow through these really, really quickly. So these are some sector-specific recommendations, and I have two pictures here. The first is UMass Boston, which is the only public four-year university in Boston. It's a really important institution for immigrant communities in that city. And they have a number of ethnic studies centers that do a lot of work to not just educate minoritized individuals in Boston, but also to provide direct research and aid to those communities. And then the next one is Shawnee State University. It's the Burnright Center for the Arts. This is a cultural center that is in, again, the Appalachian community and offers cultural offerings. So this is kind of, for me, these pictures represent what regionals do. And one of the jokes we used to say when I was at ASCU is that if Boston disappeared tomorrow, Boston would basically be the same. But if UMass Boston disappeared, it would be catastrophic for those communities. So for the sector, they need to continue innovating and advancing on their mission. I don't want to make it sound like this is all doom and gloom. I've done research on the history of these institutions. They are incredibly resilient, and they take that inspiration to be resilient from their students, who are incredibly resilient. So I think that that resiliency will serve them well, and with the coming shocks, but they also need to be mobilizing the higher education lobby to advocate for the sector. So this is where ASCU and other trade associations can come in. CJ's organization, for example. They also need to seek some financial support from regional maybe business leaders or foundations to provide that kind of direct aid. I also just want them to stop being modest about their contributions. There's kind of sometimes a woe is me, or a, almost an inferiority complex I've observed in some of the institutions in the sector. Oh, well, we're not the flagship. We're not these fancy research institutions. Well, good. I'm glad you're not, because you're serving such an important mission, and there's excellence in that. So I think they need to just continue touting their contributions and emphasize the regional economic development, the public health contributions they make, and the ways that they expand education. And then lastly, just exploit the paradoxical nature of prestige. This is something I've written about, is that prestige acts as a way to limit innovation, actually, and by not being prestigious, they actually are in an advantageous position to really innovate and be really centered on what their students need. So that's it for me. Sorry, I went over time.
Great, thanks, Cecilia. Here are some of Cecilia's references. And we're gonna go ahead and move on to the Q&A in a second. One thing I do wanna say, Cecilia, I, like you, was a swirler. And though I graduated from UCLA, I would have never been able to have got to where I was without, excuse me, attending a California State University campus, which was a regional campus at one point, and multiple different community colleges, which were regional institutions in their area. So these institutions are super important. The other thing that you brought on here that you just briefly mentioned was the issue we have with mission creep in regional institutions for lots of different reasons, but oftentimes potentially to compete for funding or to have more of an allure, are attempting to, mimic other types of institutions, usually research universities, and how that can work against the harm of their the actual harm of their institutional mission. Can you talk a little bit more about the issue with this and how it does a disservice to serving the community and also the state's interests?
Yeah, Linda, thank you for that. And I also forgot that we had another poll, so I'll ask you to launch that after I share remarks. So there is a dominant narrative that exists that many, if not most, regionals are striving for prestige, and it is a phenomenon in the sector. It has material consequences for their vital missions. But what I found in my research, and I've done research on probably 150 regionals at this point, I would guess. And then my work through ASCII, working with the entire sector, is actually there's far more mission-centeredness in the sector than gets attention. And I'm working on a chapter for the New Directions for Higher Education talk, and it's meant to do some myth busting about the sector. The issue is, and one of the things that I do is I just go through and I analyze some of the media coverage of the sector. And when you see the media, and they do this too with like in particular HBCUs. So, and one HBCU maybe is struggling financially, or maybe there's a president that's not making great decisions. And every sector is vulnerable to presidents not making great decisions. That's not a uniquely HBCU problem. But when regionals and community colleges and these other access institutions are covered in the media, often when they talk about striving for prestige, they just say, oh, and this is a problem with the entire sector. Well, actually, there is a lot of mission centers in the sector. So I just want to put that out there, that I just don't want to convey this idea that they aren't mission-centered. Another piece of that too is that, again, the way that we as society evaluate institutions, the kind of assumptions we make about them, that creates a broader societal narrative of what a legitimate university is and does. And regionals receive that mission, and they realize that being open enrollment, that being very community-centered and locally focused is not seen as legitimate. What's seen as legitimate is being selective in your admissions policies, having a national or international reputation. And so some of them do fall into thinking that, okay, well, if we don't have broad societal recognition for our mission, then maybe we should be striving to look like the flagship. And it's frustrating, not just because that harms the mission and the students that attend these institutions. It also is really difficult to do when you have such a small endowment or tiny reserves or not a lot of revenue coming in. And so that can really put them at risk financially. But then the other piece of that is, as state funding declines, they are looking for revenue streams elsewhere. And in higher ed, one of our other revenue streams would be to pursue research funding. And so that also is kind of like it's a Sophie's choice in a sense, that if we bring in more funding this way, then maybe we can support our access mission. So you see a lot of institutions that say, we want to keep this access mission, but we're also grafting on top of it this research mission. And then one last thing I'll say about that, because I want to hear what other folks, any other questions they have about the other two presenters. But in terms of research, this is something that people often assume when regionals are doing research, they're doing it to pursue prestige. Actually, again, in my research, I found that many of them are doing research that's directly tied to the needs of their regions and offering doctorate degrees because the regions need maybe expertise in water sanitation. So an example of that is the University of Wisconsin Whitewater, so water in the title, so it's easy for me to remember which institution does this. They have a very robust research effort around trying to study the waterways, do water treatment, and then infusing their research into policy discussions and decision making at the state level and the regional level. So some might view that as striving for prestige, but that is very clearly an enactment of the regional service mission. So yes, the striving for prestige does happen. It has material consequences for their overall mission, but it's not a fact of life for the entire sector. And I think there are a lot of really important external factors that play into that.
Well, thanks. I think that that's a really important thing in what you talked about how regional institutions need to really set their own agenda for what success looks like and really promote themselves is, I think, super important to moving away from this idea of higher education looks like this and to really seize on that narrative. We do have a few questions that were submitted, and I'd like to start with one that I think all of you could address, but I'll ask Eric and CJ to address first. So a question came in through the Q&A, which says, how do we get policymakers to care more about and focus on equity without having to resort to arguments around interest convergence or a neoliberal pursuits?
I'll start off thinking about what we do. So our answer to that is coalition, like creating these coalitions of communities that have generally been excluded and historically been excluded from higher education, bringing them together and then having one another carry each other's water is so helpful. And an example of that would be when we were talking to like policymakers during some earlier HEA conversations, they were trying to kind of pit women's groups against each other and then racial groups against women's groups regarding some Title IX stuff. However, we had this higher education civil rights coalition that included many of the women's groups and also included many of the racial justice groups. And so we knew where each other stood. And so while people on the Hill and policymakers on the Hill were trying to peel people off, we were already shored up there. And so that helps to create a situation in which they can try to go for like the scarcity model and say, oh, there's not enough for everyone. But we know that like there are people for whom they live at the intersection of these identities. So it doesn't, like that is one bucket, but also equity for one is equity for all, because like we're all moving towards a more just society, hopefully. And so that's really our solution to that, is making sure that we have a broad, diverse coalition and we have an understanding of where people are, because perhaps we don't agree on everything, but there is a way in which we can help each other accomplish a goal. That's what we will try to do.
Thanks, DJ. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Dr. Argandara. For me, I think about, it's something that we really haven't seen or envisioned in terms of making arguments about racial equity without tying it to like a stronger workforce or a stronger economy, or playing up the neoliberal effects to policymakers. So while their imperative is economic and ours is more moral or social justice oriented, I think similar to CJ, it is about solidarity and coalition building. That way they have to listen to us. They have to bring us to the room, and not just the room to listen, but also in the decision-making process. And so for me, I really think about the ways that we build racial solidarity to address these longstanding issues and require them to pay attention and take action. But it's really difficult, because the thing that I default to sometimes, and I've been socialized to, is like, although we want to address the racial injustices, like what would it mean for degree completion to increase by 20% for the Latinx community? You know, that equals a 3 billion influx in our state economy. And so that is also unlearning some of the things that we've been trained, I would say for myself as an academic and as a faculty member. When we do go to the Capitol or to these convenings, it's always like, all right, you have these more just oriented imperatives, but let's frame it in a neoliberal argument so that the what they're hearing plays to their ideology and their values.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue in how we're trained, Eric, is how do we get the ear? But then we begin to, in some ways, take take those things on too. And so it's how do you work against that then and create a change, because we also are critically pushing back against the neoliberal imposition at the same time we use it. And so it becomes this kind of weird thing that can really kind of mute what we might otherwise contribute, though it does tend to get the ear of policymakers. Cecilia, before we move on to another question, do you have anything you want to add there?
I agree. So neoliberalism, it is something I have spent a lot of my time writing about, critiquing, working against. But then I'm in conversations with policymakers, and if that's the argument that's going to get them to increase funding to regionals and community colleges, I'm making that argument. Because the longer term impacts are so important. One thing I'm concerned about, and this was a paper I presented at ARA, it still hasn't been published, not even close to being published, so maybe it's some public accountability to get that thing out. But one argument that I made with a student of mine, Catherine Robert, is that it's really dangerous though when we situate college access in these neoliberal arguments, because what happens if the economy no longer needs students of color to get college degrees, or needs working class folks to get college degrees? Does that suddenly end the college access imperative? So I think even as we are participating in making these arguments for expanded access and resources, particularly for marginalized communities, we need to be also infusing in that argument the larger equity imperative and always making that argument as well. So I think we had a poll. So is this a good time? Linda, you're muted. Okay, yes. So we were wondering, just based on what you're seeing in the last few weeks of some of the strategies your institutions are using to respond to COVID-19 related funding impacts. These were some that we had come up with. Obviously, there are more. Unfortunately, the poll doesn't allow you to enter in additional information, but if there are some that your institution are taking that aren't listed in this poll, can you please chat them in so we could just get a sense of how institutions are responding. And then I think you can mark multiple of these in responses. And then whenever, Linda, you're able to display the poll. I don't know quite how this works. Okay. All right. So we see the largest responses: relaxed admissions requirements. This is great news for college access. I personally am very happy that we can't do standardized testing, because that has been a key generator of inequality in our higher education system. And then personnel layoffs, reduced staff professional development funds, holding virtual town halls. So that's one of the largest ones. And then we have some coming in through the chat. So Matthew shares working remotely has been a strategy on our campus. Yep, I think many of us are working remotely. And this for regionals, and I imagine community colleges as well, is placing some strain too, because they already have very reduced staffing to begin with. So to have IT support for faculty who are trying to figure out how to teach online, or for staff and administrators working from home and needing that IT support, it's really difficult. So thanks for participating in that poll.
We're about at the end of our time. I have two quick questions. One I'd like CJ to address, and one for Eric to address that were asked earlier, and I promised folks. So CJ, one of our participants asked for you to share a bit more about how institutions can't use the care funds to reimburse themselves for having to have reimbursed to given students money.
Yeah, so that was one of the concerns amongst advocates, was that like students need these funds really quickly, particularly seeing how the allocations were going to a lot of money was going to some flagship schools and things like that. And there were some concerns there, but the education department issued guidance saying that the pot of money that's designated for emergency student grants that is supposed to go directly to students. That is not supposed to be used to reimburse your own institution for refunding the student. There is a situation in which like this is not congressional intent by any stretch, but there's a world in which like an institution could set up like charge a tuition or charge a fee for technology, for instance, because everyone's going to distance and remote learning. So they could charge a technology fee or increase the technology fee and then allow that to be the way that, or reason for the student to receive money. And so that the student can receive a grant to then repay the institution for that technology fee. But again, the whole goal behind this is to help students make sure that they are able to either continue their education or not be penalized for having to pause their education due to COVID-19 interruption. And so that was where that came from.
Yeah, I think there are always ways that institutions can work to capture dollars that are directed to students. So hopefully institutions will follow on getting that aid specifically out to students. And then real quickly, Eric, can you talk about the, someone asked for you to address, is there a difference between race-conscious policy analysis and critical policy analysis?
Yeah, so critical policy analysis is more the umbrella term that has been used since about the 1990s. It's also one of those things where like your citation practice really frames where you're coming from, right? So if you're using some of the more contemporary stuff by Sarah Diem or Michelle Young that have kind of really helped us understand the landscape, or old school like Baki or Allen, or even more comparative in terms of international. So like a Fairclough or G, if you're going into like also discourse analysis related to policy analysis. So CPA is an umbrella term, and it allows for you to examine, power, the ways that policy impact racially minoritized students or queer students or students with different ability status. So then you can say like, oh, I study critical policy analysis or do critical policy analysis with the focus on queer students. So I'm also bringing in like queer crit or different theoretical insights. And so for me, I do critical policy analysis as an umbrella term, but more specifically, it's race-conscious policy analysis. So my focus is on understanding the ways that policies are crafted with the intent to address racial disparities in higher education.
Great, thanks. Well, I want to just give one more chance for our panelists each to have a final shout out about something that they want to leave us with, and then we're going to close today. So do we have, what final shout outs do we have, CJ, Eric, and Cecilia?
I think one of the things that I'm so concerned about is policy decisions around providing students relief. And I think about relief in multiple ways. If we think about our discourse the last 2 to 3 years about Gen Z and social isolation, what does this pandemic and stay at home mean for our students who have faced additional mental health issues? And wellness and well-being is a bigger conversation. And many of us know the under-resourced staff and services that our institutions have. So how are we thinking about mental health when our students do come back to campus or provide it remotely? The other thing is direct relief. So again, there are students who have been advocating and parents who have been suing for tuition reimbursement or instructional related costs or anything of that nature. But most importantly, I think of, who's not going to come back, whose parents have been laid off and no longer can have the luxury of attending college because they have to now provide towards the family, or all of this disorder and uncertainty has really reshaped their identity as a student, whether prioritizing immediate needs, elderly or childcare. So there are so many students, and as Cecilia has mentioned and CJ, these students are primarily low income, first gen, responsibilities with family, caretakers, racially minoritized, and that attrition will be large. And do we see that as a natural occurrence, or do we see that as something else, and maybe instill more proactive measures at the institution, at the state, and at the federal level to not allow for the most vulnerable student populations to be harmed during this time, and whether or not they come back in the fall or in the summer or anytime soon?
CJ, okay, I think, okay, all right. So just quickly, some quick thoughts. One thing I'm concerned about is the volatility in funding. So if we learned from the Great Recession, there was 2 years of that stimulus funding and it went away. And while it created a nice 2-year buffer, a number of institutions didn't know how their funding was going to play out in the next few years. And so it's really hard to do long-term planning or think in visionary, innovative ways when you don't know what your funding is going to be. So I really hope that the policies that are put into place will help address that volatility. The next piece for me is, and this is actually a tweet I read, and I really wish I could remember who tweeted this, because I really think it's important to acknowledge other people's ideas when I share them. But someone had tweeted that neoliberalism loves a crisis. And we know that white supremacy and the colonial project and all of these oppressive forces love a crisis and are seizing on this moment to perpetuate inequality and oppression. So we really need to be on guard. And it's an exhausting time. I know we're all stretched so thin right now in multiple aspects of our lives, but we really need to continue to be the voice for equity and for those who are marginalized and who aren't invited into conversations and decision making. And with regard to the volatility, Alyssa Fryer at Old Dominion University, Amy Lee at University of Northern Colorado, and Sophia Latterman at SHIO have done some really exciting work around volatility and probably have recommendations there. But all of our student groups need very differentiated things. So Indigenous students need things that are different than Black and African American students, than parents. And so I think in our responses, we really need to think in those nuanced, differentiated ways how policy can support those various communities.
Yes, to everything that has been said, absolutely. A few things as like the non-academic here. One, if you have equity work, as we're talking to policymakers, please send it to advocates on the outside. A lot of your work is behind paywalls. And so a lot of the community advocacy organizations don't have access to that just because of their orientation. Two, I'm also very worried about state funding and how this is going to affect access. I think higher education, as we all know, is one of the first things to kind of get cut, but perhaps there is something else that is interesting to counterbalance that. So what if we were to decarcerate some people who are currently incarcerated, reduce that funding and move that over into higher education? Because we're paying more to keep people incarcerated than we are to educate them on the state level. And so perhaps some interesting innovative thinking around that, about what we can present to state policymakers, can be helpful. And then the last thing is that the CARES Act's reporting requirements about how this money is used is pretty bare. And so like institutions and states don't have to report a ton. And so I would implore people to advocate that there is more reporting done on the state level so that there's some viewing of how this money is being distributed. Because while it's distributed based on Pell enrollment, it doesn't necessarily have to go to Pell. That ratio doesn't have to go to Pell students or students from underrepresented communities. So these are three things that keep me up at night.
Well, CJ, I really think you say, send us your stuff because it's behind paywalls is important. Higher education scholars often think, how can I get this into the hands of policymakers? But we need to first focus on our advocates that are working for us and on our behalf. So thank you very much for that, as well as all my panelists for your last comments. We're gonna end here. Shout out to Julie Marlett, who's been our facilitator here today and is putting all this together. She does great work. Our next panel here is coming up on Monday. We have a great group of panelists and another fantastic moderator. Thank you all out there for being here with us today. And again, thanks to to Julie and our panelists. It was great to spend some time with you today.